Today we will explore a fascinating and frequently neglected aspect of medieval life: the companion animals that populated the homes, castles, and monasteries of the British Isles in centuries past. Before we continue with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. When we think of the Middle Ages, our minds often evoke images of knights in shining armor, imposing castles rising against stormy skies, and peasants toiling arduously in endless fields. Rarely, however, do we stop to consider an element that permeated all strata of this complex and rigorously hierarchical society: the presence of animals that lived side by side with humans, not merely as tools of labor, but as true companions. Among all the creatures that shared existence with the inhabitants of the great kingdom of Albion, there was one that stood out above the rest for its universal importance. The dog occupied a singular position in medieval society, crossing all social classes and fulfilling diverse roles that mirrored the complex stratification of that era. For men of different social standings, both those of high lineage and those of humble origin, the canine represented much more than simple company. It was a working partner, a guardian, a status symbol, and in many cases a true member of the family. Members of the nobility kept dogs specialized in hunting, animals that functioned simultaneously as practical instruments and symbols of prestige. The pursuit of the hunt represented a central element in aristocratic English culture, serving not only as a source of food, but as a demonstration of skill, courage, and social refinement. The hounds employed in these expeditions directly reflected the status of their owners, and the more impressive the animal, the greater the prestige conferred upon its master. But the canine presence was not limited to the halls of the powerful. Common folk also raised dogs, albeit under significant restrictions that reveal much about the social hierarchies of the time and how power was exercised even over the most mundane aspects of life. Technically, commoners were not authorized to use their dogs for hunting. We can easily imagine, however, that this prohibition was frequently ignored in practice. Those who inhabited the forest regions, such as the Great Weald, were permitted to keep a dog, but with a peculiar and disturbing condition. The animal had to have its claws removed, an intentional mutilation designed to reduce its effectiveness as a hunter. It is reasonable to suppose that many dogs escaped this cruel fate, kept discreetly away from the eyes of the authorities, although officially, the law required that any dog kept in the woodland environment undergo this painful procedure. In rural communities across the shires, dogs performed essential functions as guardians of property and companions to laborers. For those who tended swine or drove flocks of sheep, a dog was not merely useful, but absolutely indispensable. The life of a shepherd or a swineherd without a faithful dog at his side would be practically impossible to imagine. Sheepdogs already existed during the medieval period, performing functions similar to those of their modern descendants, guiding flocks through hills and vales, protecting them from predators, and maintaining the cohesion of the group. Although we cannot be absolutely certain about the level of training they received, there are good reasons to believe they were likely as well prepared as contemporary sheepdogs. They might not have belonged to the exact breeds we know today, nor possessed the same refined specialization developed over centuries of modern selective breeding, but they certainly fulfilled their role with competence and dedication. Swineherds also relied on dogs, trained to keep the pigs under control during their wanderings through the woods in search of acorns and other forage. And just as happens in our day, many farmers simply kept companion dogs that accompanied them in their daily activities, offering not only practical help, but also solace and companionship in lives often marked by hardship and solitude. There is a particularly touching detail regarding the dogs of laborers. Records indicate that builders, masons, and people involved in manual labor also owned dogs. A specific note about the dogs of workers mentions that these were crossbreeds, curiously spelled with a go as mooters in the old orthography, and that their function included guarding the bags and bottles of their masters. This small fragment of information offers us a moving window into everyday medieval life in towns like Winchester. Among the breeds mentioned frequently in the English records, greyhounds occupy a prominent place, They appear both in illuminated illustrations in precious manuscripts and in literary texts of the time, suggesting they were not only common, but also admired and valued. Their appearance was remarkably similar to modern greyhounds, demonstrating a genetic continuity that has crossed the centuries. They were elegant dogs, with slender bodies and aerodynamic lines, classified as sighthounds used to chase prey in open fields and assist in the hunt in general. Their speed and agility were legendary even then. There also existed a variety of dog that did not survive to our times, known as the eland. This creature was described as an extraordinarily robust version of the greyhound, characterized by having a massive and disproportionately large head that gave it a formidable and intimidating appearance. These animals were considered larger than mastiffs, which were already impressive themselves, and it remains uncertain whether the breed is completely extinct, or if the descriptions refer to something different from what we imagine when we try to reconstruct their image mentally. The elands were employed to corner bears and other large game, a task that required not only physical size, but also extraordinary courage and controlled ferocity. They represented the pinnacle of hunting dogs in terms of size and power, the true heavy weapons of the medieval hunting arsenal. At the other end of the spectrum, we find smaller breeds. The Springers, for example, received their name due to their region of origin in the southern marches. These dogs specialized in hunting, waterfowl and retrieving downed prey, particularly in environments near the water. There were therefore several types of dogs that we could potentially recognize today, although selective breeding was not remotely as specialized as it later became. Indeed, it can be argued that many modern breeds were developed far beyond the functional form originally necessary for hunting work. There is another fascinating reference to the elands, coming from the same writer who described them. He mentions that they were fed the repugnant parts discarded by butchers. This image is striking. Presumably, these were the absolutely unpalatable remains resulting from the slaughtering process. Although offal was commonly consumed by people in medieval times, apparently some residues were considered unfit even for human consumption, being then destined for these gigantic dogs. The nauseating things found in the butcher's shop were, therefore, considered appropriate to feed an eland, should someone have the luck or the misfortune to own one. A writer from the 14th century offered us his vision of the ideal dog. According to him, the animal should be brave and gentle, following the commands of its master obediently. It should demonstrate courtesy toward its canine companions, but was permitted to show ferocity before wild beasts. This description reveals not only practical expectations, but also social values projected onto animals. The dogs kept by the nobility received exceptional care that frequently surpassed the treatment given to servants or peasants. This fact, though it may shock us today, reveals much about the priorities and values of medieval society, where a valuable hunting dog could hold more practical and symbolic importance than a human being of low station. Sir Geoffrey of Warwick, an English noble and authority on hunting matters, in his meticulous treatise on hunting dogs, describes kennels built of wood raised off the ground to protect the animals from the damp and cold emanating from the soil. He speaks of mandatory daily exercises to keep the dogs in optimal physical condition, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of canine needs. The treatise also mentions the presence of fireplaces to keep the animals warm during the rigorous northern winters. These dogs lived, therefore, in conditions possibly superior to those of many human beings of the time, an irony that would not go unnoticed by the more critical observers of that period. The author also reveals a curious and somewhat disturbing detail. A young boy was required to sleep in the kennels during the night. Although this may sound unpleasant, his function was to prevent the dogs from fighting among themselves during the darkness and to ensure they remained warm. Perhaps the lad also benefited from the heat provided by blankets, but it certainly does not seem like a particularly pleasant task for a child. Women of high social standing kept a different category of companion animal. Lapdogs were especially popular among the ladies of the nobility, although this practice attracted significant criticism. As we can easily imagine, certain observers considered these animals a frivolous distraction that diverted women from more valuable activities. A specific and quite severe quote classifies lapdogs as instruments of folly and idleness that distract women from more laudable exercises. The critic goes further, suggesting that these women found more pleasure in their small dogs than in their own children. Despite these moralizing censures, numerous powerful women appear portrayed in paintings of the era, accompanied by their prized lapdogs. As for the appearance of these animals, they were remarkably small, with features vaguely reminiscent of a ferret. Sometimes it becomes difficult to determine precisely what kind of creature they represent, but they generally seem to be terriers of reduced dimensions, with pointed snouts, not much different from the small terriers we know today. There is a type of animal about which we have not yet spoken extensively, and that is due to the fact that cats possessed a deeply ambiguous reputation during the medieval period. These felines were associated with witchcraft and the occult, involved in superstitions and fears that occasionally resulted in cruel persecutions. But they were simultaneously kept by noblewomen and used in domestic contexts where their utility was indisputable. Their practical function was unquestionable: to control populations of mice and rats that infested barns, pantries, and residences. The high clergy even suggested at one point that people should not keep them, reflecting the sinister associations surrounding these animals, but generally they were recognized as extremely useful. They represented, in a way, the opposite of dogs. They could not really be trained to perform specific tasks or follow complex commands, but they were invaluable for controlling rodents, particularly mice, but also rats, which would have been present everywhere in the medieval countryside and in the villages and towns of the time, perhaps in greater concentration in urban environments than in rural communities, where the storage of grain and other foods created an ideal habitat for these pests. Cats were kept, therefore, but most of them likely lived outdoors, fighting for a small corner of indoor space and functioning as what we today call yard cats. We know people who breed horses and keep what they call a stable cat, a semi-feral animal that is fed, observed, and minimally cared for, but which does not come inside to sit with the family and receive the treatment reserved for a proper pet. We are not sure if we could describe most medieval cats as pets, in the strict sense. They likely belonged more to the category of working animals. Birds of prey represent another complex theme. They could be considered pets, but they were predominantly associated with hunting. The type of bird of prey one possessed was directly related to one's social status. Kings and emperors kept eagles, for example. These rules were widely disregarded, although they were formally recorded. We can imagine that people simply chose a practical bird suited to the work they needed to perform, whether capturing rabbits or any other prey. This is a specific area of discussion in its own right. Were birds of prey pets? Some are considered so today, but again they seem to fall more into the category of utilitarian animals appreciated for their functionality than true companions. Naturally, it should not surprise us that kings kept pets. One of the most famous examples is King Edward IV, a monarch who ruled the Great Kingdom at the transition into the modern era. Edward was an extremely astute monarch, demonstrating deep awareness of the political aspects of royalty and understanding instinctively how public image could be cultivated and manipulated. He was also skilled in the manipulation of public opinion, using all available resources to consolidate his power and legitimize his reign. He kept animals in the great fortress of Winchester that were put on public display during certain periods, transforming the fortress into a sort of royal zoo avant la lettre. Frequently, these were exotic animals offered to him as diplomatic gifts by other monarchs and foreign potentates, creatures that English subjects would never have had the opportunity to see otherwise. The poor creatures were likely not cared for adequately or carefully. Those responsible probably did not know how to handle an elephant, a polar bear, a lion, or whatever the animal in question was. The dietary, climatic, and behavioral needs of these creatures from distant lands were completely unknown. These creatures functioned more as circus spectacles, attractions meant to impress and marvel the masses, demonstrating the reach and power of the English realm, and the unfortunate animals likely did not survive for long under such conditions. Although we have not been able to find many details about them, one thing is certain: they were definitely not pets in the traditional sense. They were manifestations of power and dominion, living symbols of royal authority and the monarch's ability. to command tribute from exotic lands. It is interesting to note that the last native bear of the Great Kingdom was killed approximately in 1240, and the last English wolf around 1390. Some sources claim that wolves persisted in the Northern Highlands until the 18th century, but the records are sparse and uncertain. During the medieval period, these animals were already quite rare. Therefore, if someone went out to hunt, unless it was at the very beginning of the medieval era, they would not be chasing bears in Albion, and they could possibly hunt wolves only in the most remote regions. It is worth remembering that there were numerous settlements scattered throughout the territory, and in truth, not much truly wild area remained in the heart of the kingdom at the height of the medieval period. Lastly, but certainly no less fascinating, we discovered during our research something truly surprising. Priests and nuns kept pets. This is an entirely separate topic that deserves our attention, as it reveals extraordinary aspects of medieval religious life and the tensions between the demands of contemplative life and natural human impulses. Monks keeping pets seems to have been a fairly widespread practice, although officially disapproved of by higher authorities, who saw this indulgence as a distraction from a life of prayer and devotion. It is not clear if this was simply a matter of maintaining disciplinary control over the religious, ensuring their focus remained on spiritual matters, or if the prohibition was genuinely applied with rigor, but there are revealing records of an Archbishop of Salisbury who explicitly declared that no member of his household should keep a pet dog or a songbird for company. Another abbot specifically forbade dogs, rabbits, and small songbirds as pets, which indicates, to us inadvertently but clearly, precisely what types of animals the monks were indeed keeping in their quarters or on the monastery grounds. Monastic records mention pets such as ravens, squirrels, and even bears. The idea of gifting a bear to a monk seems extreme, but that is exactly what the documents indicate. In the 13th century, the Bishop of York apparently kept a pair of monkeys for his spiritual enlightenment. Here we have, therefore, an extremely important member of the clergy raising monkeys as pets, and this was considered acceptable. It seems that rules varied enormously from one religious house to another regarding the types of animals permitted. Mention is made of rabbits, songbirds, ravens, bears, and dogs. Curiously, cats do not appear frequently in the regulations regarding religious pets. For us conducting this research, it seems that religious people possessed the most diverse collection of pets imaginable. Common people kept practical and sensible animals, while the monks seem to have been carried away by much more eccentric choices. Ravens and bears are quite impressive companions after all. Even the saints kept pets. In the 12th century, an individual named Alphege, who subsequently became Saint Alphege, raised a pet horse. This horse had a name, Ash, sometimes spelled A-S-H-E. There is not much more information recorded beyond this, but the simple idea of a saint owning a named pet horse is absolutely charming. Finally, we come to a detail that illuminates medieval daily life in an extraordinary way. Apparently, medieval people also took their pets to church. There is a formal complaint, a letter written by a village priest, complaining that common people brought their dogs and puppies to church. These animals ran freely, barking and distracting everyone present, and occasionally eating the sacred books. To imagine the chaotic pets of the people running through the church, while something solemn occurred at the front, with many people talking in the background and dogs running from one side to another, causing a ruckus and interrupting the religious service, is a wonderfully vivid image. This scenario was sufficiently disturbing that specific priest, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, felt the need to draft a formal letter of complaint. Pets were important to medieval people. It seems that the more free time one possessed, the greater the variety and exoticism of the animals one could keep. It is fascinating to observe that religious people apparently raised more exotic pets, perhaps because they had more idle time. Common people kept undisputedly more practical animals, while the nobility possessed animals as much for demonstrations of status as for any other reason. Just as happens in our day, some people use pets as symbols of prestige, while others keep them as companions that bring happiness and joy to their lives. May that tradition continue for a long time yet. If this journey through the history of medieval companion animals has sparked your curiosity about how our ancestors lived and related to the natural world around them, we invite you to become part of this community of history explorers. Subscribe to our channel to dive into more fascinating narratives that bring the past to life. Leave a like if this documentary enriched your understanding of the Middle Ages, and share in the comments. What kind of pet would you have chosen if you lived in medieval times? Your participation keeps the flame of historical knowledge alive and inspires us to continue unearthing the forgotten stories that shape the world we live in today.